The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, GDPR and Life Sciences, Understanding the Challenges, Impact, and Opportunities. My name is Josh Richards. I'm the Marketing Director for Merit Solutions, and I'm joined today by one of our close partners and someone we think is the leading validation expert in the industry, Valerie King-Bailey, CEO of Onshore Technology Group. And I'll let Valerie reintroduce herself here in a couple of minutes. We have a full agenda planned for the next 45 to 60 minutes, but I did want to take a couple of minutes to briefly introduce Merit Solutions and help frame the discussion for today before handing controls over to Valerie. Before doing that, I do want to point out that this session is being recorded, and the recording will be provided to all attendees following the event. If time permits, at the end, we will open the floor for some Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A panel on your screen, and you can submit any questions electronically, and we'll try to address all questions following our content today. So who is Merit Solutions? We are a global consulting and digital technology company. We're headquartered in Chicago, and we have 5 offices throughout the US and in Europe. Our strategy is to be deep and not wide. So we focus 100% on the Microsoft Business Platform and within the manufacturing sector, with a large, I'd say majority of our clients falling within the FDA regulated space, including pharma, med device, biotech, and food companies. I think we're really unique right now in terms of Microsoft consulting organizations, as our expertise reaches across the entire platform, from the traditional ERP, CRM, QMS, document management apps, all the way to the newer digital capabilities we're seeing come out, such as mobile apps, IoT, machine learning, things like that. So we're capable of being your single source provider of all your digital technology needs, and that's not something we've seen many other organizations capable of promising. But what I think is most important to our clients and perhaps to those on the call today are client satisfaction scores. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is a trailing representation of the previous 17 quarters of client satisfaction scores, where you can notice that our clients consistently rate us above a 4 out of 5. Again, we think this is extremely rare in a space where Gartner says 55 to 75% of projects fail to achieve their desired objectives. So we're really proud of those scores, and we do whatever we can to achieve successful outcomes for all of our clients. That, I think, wraps up my talking points for today. So with that, I'll hand controls over to Valerie and let her reintroduce herself and get into our topic of discussion. So Valerie, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you this afternoon for joining us for today's webinar. I have a very informative session for you today regarding GDPR and its impact on validation and validated systems. Just by way of introduction about me, I've got about 30 years of experience in independent validation and verification. I've worked for 3 software companies, and most notably for Abbott Laboratories, where I was Director of Document Management and Quality Systems. Onshore is based in Chicago, and we are an independent validation and verification firm specializing in the delivery of solutions designed to manage and execute and maintain computer systems validation projects worldwide. The building that you're looking at all the way on the right-hand side that sits on the pinnacle of Lake Michigan is Lake Point Tower, and that's where Onshore is located in the heart of the downtown area. So without further ado, let's get into our talk today. I found that this topic of GDPR was very important, and in consultation with Merit, I decided to put together this webinar to inform the FDA-regulated community, which includes all companies, food and drug and medical device and biologics companies, what the issues are surrounding the new European regulation, GDPR. So today's topics, I'm going to talk about what is GDPR, and for those of you who may not be as familiar, I'm going to go over a few highlights of what it is. It's more challenging than you may think, and we'll talk about why I say that. And then I want to talk about GDPR in the context of computer systems validation, and I'll share with you why I started to think about computer systems validation with GDPR. Then I'm going to share with you some principles and best practices for validation related to GDPR. And then I want to take you through a hypothetical case study. And this is, the reason I say hypothetical is GDPR is just about a month old. So we don't have real case studies, but I wanted to present to you a hypothetical to get you thinking about how this may, A, impact your organization and what you can do about it. And then I'll tell you what are the 10 steps towards GDPR and computer systems validation success. What should you be doing? And at the end, I'm going to save a little time for question and answer to answer any topics that may interest you. So without further ado, let's talk about GDPR and what it is and why you should be concerned about it at this time. For those of you who don't know, May 25th was the date. GDPR came into effect May 25th, 2018. In April of 2016, the EU Commission adopted GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. This is a regulation that most think is the most important change in privacy regulations in Europe. It certainly is touted as probably one of the most stringent regulations for data privacy. It replaces the Europeans' kind of patchwork of national protection laws with a single set of rules. So what the EU was attempting to do is to put together a single set of rules that are directly enforceable in each EU member state. The GDPR was designed to harmonize protection laws while at the same time modernizing them and most importantly taking into account new technological advancements. And so it's applicable in all 28 EU member states. This law impacts validated and non-validated systems. And I'll talk about that in just a bit. When you think about the impact of GDPR, you have to look at three elements: people, processes, and technology. From the people side, the main protected entity are the data subjects, the individuals whose privacy the EU is attempting to protect. There are certain rights and freedoms that are afforded to these individuals. There are regulations concerning the lawful and fair processing of their private information or personal information. And then most importantly, there's a stipulation in the regulation that says an individual has a right to be forgotten. In other words, they have a right to be removed from your databases. That's the people side of it. And then there are the processes. And this is where this gets interesting for validated systems. There are data access requirements, data processing requirements, data holding requirements, data mapping requirements, data transfers, not transfers, excuse the typo, breach response, and user awareness and training. And then on the third side of the three-legged stool, there is the security aspects of individual data. Data storage, data erasure, and deletion. Now, this is super important for validated systems, and I'll get into that. Data archival and data retention. We're going to talk about that. And then identity and access management. So when you look at all three of these, what GDPR is asking is privacy by design in today's computer systems. Now, this is a diagram that's courtesy of Accenture, but I thought it was important to kind of share what are the 8 primary GDPR requirements. And if you look at the different circles, the circles are indicative of the estimated magnitude of the impact on your organizations. So when you look at the technology landscape, you have investment in human resources and training, increased data governance and inventory, data breach response. The GDPR has a 72-hour window for data breach responses. That's a very tight window to notify not only regulators, but individuals of a potential data breach. And then you have privacy engineering, third-party management. When you think of today's systems, it generally is, composed of multiple players. There's not a single player in an enterprise solution. Just think about Microsoft Dynamics for just a second. Microsoft provides Azure and the Dynamics environment, but they're third-party integrated technologies that are integrated with Microsoft Dynamics 365. So how do you manage those third parties? And then data erasure. The reason why that circle is the biggest one on the page, next to transparency, is data erasure deals with that whole right to be forgotten aspect of GDPR. And then data portability. I don't know if you know this, but individuals have a right to have their data ported from one system to another. So what this means is you have to keep track and put data into a format that's easily portable. We're going to talk about that. And then transparency with customers. So the first time I read GDPR, and this is what put the bug in my ear for this seminar, is I started thinking about each of these as it relates to validated computer systems. So when you think about this, this is kind of the high-level landscape of the requirements of GDPR. Let's get into this a little bit more. GDPR is a European regulation affecting the 28 EU countries. However, GDPR applies to companies located within the EU where processing activities are related to goods and services offered to individuals in the EU, or, and this is the big or, where the behavior of individuals located in the EU is monitored regardless of where processing activities take place. So that means you could have a company like Merit, for example, in the United States responsible for processing data in the EU. Therefore, GDPR not only affects organizations within the EU, they affect organizations across geographical boundaries. So let's talk about a couple of concepts that it's important for you to understand when you're thinking of GDPR. What is personal data? What do they mean by that? Personal data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. They call that person a data subject. So whenever you see the term data subject, they're referring to a natural person. It's an identifiable person is one who can be identified either directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identification number or to one or more factors specific to his or her physical, physiological, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity. Think about your enterprise systems. Let's take, and I'm picking on ERP systems because Merit Solutions is an ERP vendor. So when you think about your ERP systems, think about the potential data in those systems. Now, this is just not unique to ERP systems. There could be laboratory systems. There could be content management systems. There could be enterprise quality management systems. All types of systems may house personal information. So when you think about this, think about the personal information that is captured within your system and to hold that thought. There is the notion of controllers and processors in the GDPR regulation. So what's a controller? A controller is any business that determines the purposes and means of processing personal data. For example, a life sciences company like yourself. It could be a food company, a drug company, a biologics company, a medical device company. It could be any type of company that collects personal data in either an ERP system or other enterprise system. What is a processor? A processor is any business that processes personal data on behalf of the controller. So let's say, for example, that your company, Company X, is the controller, and Microsoft, because of Microsoft Azure and Dynamics 365, would be the processor. A processor is any business or other organization that stores or digitizes or catalogs information produced, like cloud service providers, like any SaaS provider, etc. So what is data processing? This is another term that you must be familiar with when you're dealing with GDPR. The definition of processing is broad. Now, most of us have heard the term data processing since the beginning of our entry into the information systems realm. But data processing covers everything to do with personal data. So in the context of GDPR, we're talking about obtaining and collecting, maintaining, storage and archiving, duplicating, including backups, encrypting and decrypting, analyzing or profiling, reading or viewing, sharing or disclosing, deleting or destroying, or transferring or transmitting data, even from system to system or country to country. So when you think about data processing and you think about that vis-a-vis independent validation and verification, this gets interesting because all of these activities happen within validated systems. So when you think about the data processing elements of GDPR, that's what we mean. Now, when we talk about lawful storage, processing, and storage of personal information, this is the context or the legal grounds for processing personal data as articulated in the GDPR regulation. And there are really 6 different pillars that you need to be concerned with: consent, contract, legal obligation, protecting vital interest, public interest, or legitimate interest. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to point out to you. Consent. Most of us who work with validated systems, we don't necessarily get permission to store data in systems. Think about this for a second. How many times have you had a system that has had a customer master list, which includes real customer names? And, or you've had a vendor master list, which includes real names in it, or any type of system. Maybe it's a document management system that includes personal information. The individual has to give clear consent for you to process their personal data for a specific purpose. When I was thinking about this webinar, this was one of the things that kind of concerned me a little bit with validated systems. Most of the time in validated systems, we don't necessarily deal with obtaining consent from every individual that we put their name and, perhaps personal information into the system. For example, think about a human resources management system. D365 includes human resources management. So in that system, I am putting the name of the person, possibly their social security number. Most of the time, HR systems do include that information. And then the name and address of the person and other personal information about the individual. According to GDPR, you need to obtain clear consent for that. Contract really refers to the processing that is necessary for a contract you have with the individual because they require you to take certain steps. So for example, if you're a compound pharmacy organization, for example, you may have a contract with the individual to process your pharmaceuticals. You may have a legal obligation requiring you to process the information. It's necessary for you to comply with the law In the United States, for example, this would be relevant to our human resources laws or our laws regarding employment. We're required to collect certain information about employees that work for the company. Vital interests. The processing of this information is necessary to protect someone's life. This could be medical information systems, for example, or public tasks. It's necessary for you to perform a task in public interest for your official functions, or legitimate interest. The processing of their data is necessary for you for legitimate interest. This can apply to you if you're a public authority and so forth. So there are legal grounds for this. Keep this in mind as we go through the following slides. GDPR principles require that information be processed lawfully and in a transparent manner. It has to be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed without the consent if the additional processing is incompatible with the original purpose. This was put in there so that you don't take information within these systems and use it, for example, for marketing purposes. Adequate and relevant and limited to what's necessary, accurate and where necessary it's kept up to date, kept in a form that permits identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary. And this is a real key thing, because what GDPR is asking is that when you process information, you don't keep it for any longer than you actually need it, or for which the consent for the information was granted. And then it's processed in a manner that ensures the security of the information. Now, there are several key changes to individual rights, and the individual rights part of GDPR is what got a lot of people excited. I put a red star beside those areas that have perhaps a significant impact on validated systems. The right to be informed, the right of access, the right to rectification. In other words, if data is incorrect within the system, you have a right, the individual has the right to have that information corrected and updated. In the United States, boy, wouldn't this be helpful dealing with our credit processing bureaus. For those of you who have ever tried to deal with credit bureaus in the past, this whole right to rectification would really help us in the United States, but unfortunately, this is an EU regulation. The right to erasure or deletion of information. Now, I put a star next to that for validation because some validated systems do not allow data to be deleted from the system, especially quality management systems that to erase the information in the quality management system would be to affect previous records. So there's an issue there. The right to restrict the processing of the information, the right to data portability. Individuals have a right to have their data ported from one system to another. The right to object to the use of the information, and then the right related to automated decision-making and profiling. These are quite comprehensive and unprecedented. Here's another one that you need to be aware of. Controllers, those people who process the information, must report data breaches within 72 hours to the supervisory authority and affected data subjects at risk. Think of this. In your validated system, if you have, say, 1,400 employees in a system where you've collected information, upon notification of the data breach, you have 72 hours to report that data breach to the authority and report this to the affected data subjects. Many companies, even in the EU, complained about this aspect of the regulation because they said the 72-hour time frame is very tight. That's, kind of less than a week that you have to report this. Failures may result in punitive fines. This is the part of the regulation that got the most attention. It's up to 4% of your turnover or 20 million euro of group annual worldwide turnover. That's a huge punitive fine for data breaches. So if your system is breached, this is the penalty, that it can go up to that. Now, that doesn't mean that every breach is created equal and it will result in a 4% impact to your turnover. It says up to 4%. So the government authorities make the determination of the severity of the breach. When you look at the personal data in ERP systems or any other systems, what the GDPR is saying that you have the right to process that data for its primary purpose. But at the end of that purpose, you can retain the information through the end of the retention period. So once you're finished with the processing of the information, there's a blocking phase where the data is blocked and is accessible only to personal personnel or authorized personnel like an auditor. Personal data no longer needed for its primary processing purpose must be deleted unless there are other retention periods defined either by law or by contract. If required by law beyond the retention period, the data has to be blocked. In other words, it has to be accessible only by people from the law or regulatory body who need to see it. Think about 21 CFR Part 11 audit trails when we think about removing data. This is a complicated issue. If 21 CFR Part 11 audit trails are implemented, they will confirm the deletion of the information because deleting a record in 21 CFR Part 11 is an auditable event. But when you look at the life cycle of the information, what I was trying to convey to you today is think about this in the context of your validated computer systems. So what all of this means, guys, is that it is really time to rethink how we validate computer systems. The new GDPR regulation forces validation engineers to rethink how these systems are tested and maintained. There are technical controls in GDPR that you need to confirm when you're validating systems. So for example, validation risk assessments must now include GDPR risk. What is the risk of this personal information being exposed, for example? You need to test the GDPR technical controls and response mechanisms. If you are required to report a breach within 72 hours, it would behoove you to test that through validation to make sure that you have the ability to not only identify a breach, but to respond in kind. You also have to have documented evidence to support GDPR compliance for validated computer systems. So if you're going to validate a system, and that system also includes information, private information for European subjects, you need to confirm that. You need to assess your suppliers to ensure that they are in compliance. I'm going to get into this a little bit more when we talk about a validated system that has a third-party application bolted on. Who's responsible in case of a data breach? We'll talk about that in my case study. You have to have the ability to be able to delete and confirm the deletion of data and present this information to individual subjects. And you need to understand the impact of how data is deleted, and then better understand records management and data management retention policies for electronic records. Many of you have heard of 21 CFR Part 11. It is the electronic records and electronic signature final rule that came about in August of 1997. It's interesting that a lot of times when we think about Part 11, most people only focus on the electronic signature piece, not so much on the records. You now have to understand and establish retention policies and electronic records policies to govern the records that are in your system. And finally, as you're rethinking your validation strategies, you need to train. Train your validation engineers, train your IT department, train all of the subject matter experts within your company to understand and recognize GDPR impact in your computer systems. So that's a little bit about what GDPR is about and why you should care. I think you see that I said that it's a little bit more complicated than you think, because as you go through this, there are a lot of questions to ponder about GDPR and how it may impact you. Let's take a look at computer systems validation explicitly. I want to talk about what you need to know with respect to GDPR and CSV. Most validation testing only kind of touches the tip of the iceberg. When we generate validation tests, and I'm talking about the typical IQ, OQ, PQ, installation, operational, and performance qualification, and user acceptance testing. What we're doing in validation for the most part is we're testing the functionality of whatever application we're dealing with, and we're testing to make sure that it's suitable for a production environment. However, when you look beneath the surface, there's more that we need to concern ourselves with. We need to concern ourselves with the testing of privacy controls. GDPR requires that organizations integrate privacy controls in systems that use personal data of individuals, and that they provide consumers with products and services that automatically apply privacy-friendly settings. You need to make sure that as you're looking at your testing, that you test those privacy controls. We'll talk about those and what they are specifically in just a minute. You need to test your breach of response. I talked about that in the previous section. GDPR gives individuals the right to be notified quickly and to report data breaches within 72 hours. And then the right of data erasure. Individuals have the right to be forgotten, meaning that organizations have to erase personal information if it's no longer needed, or if the individual withdraws the consent. So as you could see, I could go on and on and on. Beneath the surface, there's a lot more testing that we need to do. So how does GDPR affect validated dynamic systems that may have information, private information about EU citizens? Dynamics 365 lives in a hosted environment. Third-party integrations are often deployed. What happens if third-party data are breached? How do you conduct supplier audits for third-party integrators in the context of GDPR? Dynamics 365 includes legally binding electronic records. What is the retention policy for these records? And what private data, if any, is collected? And how do you delete electronic records in response to the right to be forgotten in a validated system? And then how would you respond to data breaches in D365? Are you testing this process during validation? So you see that there's a lot of things to think about. Here is what you need to think about with validated systems. Does your validated system support GDPR reporting requirements? In other words, are you able to report a data breach, and are you able to confirm and report the deletion of data? In the event of a data breach, are your validated systems ready to respond? Have you addressed the right to be forgotten? Does your risk assessment include GDPR risk? Is GDPR incorporated in your overall validation strategy? Do you have the processes that require the testing of technical controls? For you and other validated systems, do you have consent policies in place to allow or to obtain the consent to process personal information? This is real important. For validation test engineers, are your internal privacy controls robust enough and tested during validation? Is the data that you store portable and transferable and tested during validation? Do you completely erase all personal data in your systems if it's no longer needed? What's the impact on the overall electronic records? Think about Part 11 again. Can you quickly recognize and report a breach within 72 hours? And are you testing this during validation. Does your supplier audit process document third parties' compliance with GDPR? I recently signed a couple of contracts with new engineers, and I was really surprised that a couple of my European clients have in the supplier audit process my compliance with third-party suppliers. So start looking at that. Here's the bottom line. Validation is all about providing documented evidence that a system performs according to its intended use. Life sciences companies must not only comply, but demonstrate compliance with GDPR. That means you have to document it. Remember the old adage within validation. If it's not documented, it did not happen. So it's imperative that you implement processes and procedure to capture and retain evidence of GDPR compliance and be able to respond effectively to requests for information. Incorporating the testing of GDPR technical controls and conducting GDPR risk assessments is essential. So what are the best practices that you need to be concerned with for computer systems validation? Here's a mini little checklist. What personal data are you storing within your systems? What do you do with it? Do you have policies, standard operating procedures, technology and contracts to protect you? Do you have consent forms, for example, that consent to the use of personal information? Are your relevant people trained? And is someone at your company ultimately responsible for GDPR? Some of the principles, we talked about this. Personal data must be processed lawfully and in a transparent manner, specific for its intended use, adequate and relevant to and limited to whatever is necessary, and accurate and kept up to date. Data portability is a key issue. Individuals have the right to port his or her information to a new vendor platform. So we talk about the 8 individual rights of individuals, the right to be informed, the right of data access, the right to rectify. We talked about these 8 individual rights that people have. So the best practices that you need to put in place, know your data protection definition. Some of it I've provided for you today. Understand the lawful grounds of data processing in your system. Know which rights your data subjects have, and know your high-risk activities. Establish GDPR procedures with your validation SOPs. I usually, at the beginning of validation projects, look at all of the SOPs that provide governance for that validated system. You need data protection SOPs as well. You need to know or test the ability to notify of a data breach. Keep track of international data transfers. In other words, if you're transferring information from the United States to the EU and vice versa. And then you need to conduct a risk assessment of GDPR and test all of the technical controls. These are the best practices that we recommend. Now I want to get into a hypothetical case study with you on GDPR. And I want to ask you the question, what if this happened in your organization? And this is just food for thought. Remember, GDPR is not really even a month old. So, we don't have, long case studies to go through right now. But I thought I would share one with you to help you to understand what all of this means. What if this happened in your organization? So here's the case hypothesis. A global life sciences company has implemented, validated, and deployed an ERP system in a cloud environment. Now, for the sake of argument, let's say this is D365. The ERP provider hosts the application on a popular cloud platform. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, this is Azure. The ERP solution leverages an integrated third-party plugin for payroll processing and expense reporting. Let's call that vendor A. Hypothetically, let's say that vendor A, the third-party integrator, experiences a global data breach. Somebody breaches the system and obtains information from the third-party plugin. Here's the question. What is the extent of the responsibility for the breach? Is Microsoft responsible? Let's say that Merit Solutions was the system integrator. Is Merit responsible? Who's responsible for that breach? Does the GDPR liability rely solely with vendor A and the processing company? Does the ERP provider or cloud infrastructure provider also bear responsibility for the breach? This is a really good question. Now, I got into this because someone actually posed this question to me about a month ago before GDPR actually became effective. I want to bring this back to you. We showed this earlier of who the controllers and the processors are. Let me just remind you again. A controller is the life sciences company that collects the data, and a processor is another organization that processes, stores, digitizes, and catalogs the information, like, Azure D365. So these are the processors and controllers. Here's the answer to our case study. It's mutual responsibility. You have to be careful. The life sciences company actually obtains consent and may even have a contract for the processing of personal data. So they bear some responsibility, but the controller or the processor, which is Azure, bears some responsibility because they are processing the information and they are responsible for the data in that. Now, this is a deeper discussion of what all of this means. But when you think about GDPR, think about this case study. It's not a simple answer to this question, but processors and controllers bear some responsibility for the processing of that information and the data breach. Because in order for them to breach the data, they would have to get through D365 and Azure. So there are some responsibilities on both sides of this. This is a very interesting question, and this is why I wanted to share this with you today, to give you some food for thought as to how this may be interpreted. Here are some 10 steps, and I'm going to conclude with this, to GDPR and CSV success. Number one, you need to conduct a readiness assessment for GDPR if you already haven't. Look at how ready you are to deal with the technical controls for validated systems. Number two, you need to assess your supplier audit processes. You need to look at third-party suppliers and how they may affect GDPR. These processes must be reviewed. So you probably already have supplier audit processes in place to deal with the current supplier audit issues. You need to look at that. Number three, this is very, very important. You need to be able to review and identify data to delete in accordance with GDP guidelines. And this is going to mean that you need to understand the retention policies around GDPR and how they may be affected. You need to review your data processes. So step 1, 2, and 3 are planning processes. This is what you need to do to get ready for GDPR if you already haven't. And this, by the way, will involve multiple stakeholders around your organization. Once you get a handle on 1, 2, and 3, step 4, you need to update your validation standard operating procedures. You need to update these to address the testing and the impact of the technical controls and processes on your validated processes. If your validated systems house personal information on European data subjects, you will have to do that. Now, one of the reasons why we're having this session today is many of the systems that Josh and I deal with at Merit Solutions, many of our systems are from multinational companies. They're not only in the United States or in London, for example, but they may be throughout the EU. If we're keeping information on EU data subjects, then we have to deal with this. with respect to our standard operating procedures. And then you're going to need to retrain your validation personnel, teach them the new standard operating procedures, data deletion processes. And what I would do, and this is something that we've done at onshore in our validation procedures already, we have incorporated GDPR test scripts. We now test our ability to be able to respond. We test the ability to delete data, and we test the ability to automatically notify when data is deleted from a system. We test retention policies. These are all things that we've incorporated, and we've retrained our validation engineers to actually look at GDPR regulatory requirements. Your validation engineers and IT personnel will need to be advised and informed about this. Number 6, and I've said this repeatedly throughout this webinar, you need to incorporate GDPR testing. You need to test the technical controls to ensure compliance readiness. You also need to establish a remediation plan if you're not compliant. So once you do the assessment, and I strongly recommend, if you haven't done so already, do a GDPR assessment to determine how ready you are to respond, and then establish a remediation plan to address any deficiencies. We've worked with several of our clients to provide for them a GDPR strategy for their companies. We got called on back in April, May, and in June from a number of our customers that we've done remediation plans with them and helped them to define the GDPR testing that I've been speaking of. Number 8, define your data retention policies. Data retention and data integrity is at the forefront and the center of GDPR. You need to establish a records management strategy, and you need to deal with data integrity as it relates to the data that's housed in your enterprise systems. And then you need to identify personal data of European subjects in your validated systems. If personal data is collected, you have to identify and obtain consent to process this information. If you haven't done so already, and this is some of the things that we did for clients in our GDPR remediation plan, is we help them not only to map out and identify the information, but identify how that information is processed. Remember I said earlier that data has to be portable now. So not only do you need to deal with the storage and the processing of that information, you also need to deal with the portability of that information. Very important. And then last step number 10, test your breach response. Test the ability to respond to a breach and how you identify a breach. In our validated systems, we do something called a cybersecurity qualification. A cybersecurity qualification, or CyQ. You've heard of IQ, OQ, PQ. CyQ is the next step in validation. Breaches can be a result of cybersecurity breaches, or they can be internal or external breaches of other sorts. You need to be able to test that. If you send me a note, I can send you a copy of our cybersecurity qualification matrix so that you know what to look at. So these are the 10 steps to your GDPR success. I encourage you to visit the Microsoft Trust Center. Here's your homework after this webinar. If you haven't done so already, visit the Microsoft Trust Center at www.microsoft.com/Trust Center. You'll see that they have a whole section on GDPR that would help you to deal with the General Data Protection Regulation and some of the key changes. This is well worth a few minutes of your time to browse through this information to determine how Microsoft actually helps you to comply with GDPR. On this Trust Center, they have a GDPR Readiness assessment. You can take this assessment for your own company free of charge. Microsoft doesn't charge you anything for that, and I took the assessment even for onshore. This is really, again, well worth your while to check it out. GDPR has serious consequences for non-compliance. It's super important that you understand if your organization is ready and how do you measure the readiness. And then, as I said in my step 10, remediate the gaps, or step 8 was remediate the gaps once you take the assessment. But this is a really good idea to do. Also, on Microsoft's website, they have a free white paper. You can get the link here. I'll send you a copy of this presentation if you want. And by the way, if you'd like a copy of the slide deck, I'm more than happy to send it to you. But you can click here to get a free copy of Microsoft's white paper. This white paper is really excellent, and it shows a little bit more in detail and deals with some of the principles and best practices that I've talked about here to help you comply with GDPR. So the bottom line is GDPR is a current regulation. It's probably one of the most comprehensive regulations for data protection and data privacy in the EU. Don't think that this doesn't affect you, but it does. And don't think that it doesn't affect validated and non-validated systems. It affects both. So with that, I thank you for listening today, and I open it up to any questions you may have. Josh, can you let us know if anyone has any questions on your side?
Yep, Valerie, so far I don't have any that you or I haven't already sent over to you. So you should have the first couple. Again, everyone, there should be a Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen as Valerie goes through the first, I think, 3 or 4 questions that we have. You can feel free to submit any other questions you have, and we'll feed those in at the bottom as well.
Yes. I had another question about the breach notification, Josh. And one of the respondents replied, the response aspect of GDPR seems aggressive. Do we have to report a breach within 72 hours? And the answer is yes. This is the newest addition to the European approach to the regulation and a primary concern for most regulations. It's a tight response time frame of 72 hours. When a vendor of a business suffers a data loss or breach, either standalone or as part of a processing chain, they must notify and report the loss or breach to the business. The controllers within the business must notify the local data protection authority, which depends on whatever geographic region you're in. The severity of the incident is based on whether there is a high risk or harm to the individuals whose data has been breached, and depending on the severity, the business will be also obligated to report the event or incident to the impacted individuals. So this is a real key concern for data breaches. The second question that came in is, what do you recommend that validation teams do to get ready for the GDPR? That's an excellent question. The first thing that I would recommend is that validation teams conduct a readiness assessment and go through those 10 points that I highlighted to make sure that you're ready. The biggest thing that you need to do is get a cybersecurity qualification SOP. Number 1, develop a GDPR validation SOP. GDPR for Validated Systems Standard Operating Procedure, and then incorporate some of the testing and controls in your validation testing. If you remember my iceberg diagram, we only scratch the surface when we validate computer systems. If you don't take anything away from what I said today, take this point away. We really have to rethink how we validate systems above and beyond the traditional IQ, OQ, PQ, and user acceptance testing. There are data privacy issues and data integrity issues that are huge impacts on systems. We have to test them. Remember, in validated systems, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So while there's no statute that says you have to validate, it just makes good business sense. And by the way, the statutes and the regulations are coming. It's a good idea for you to be ahead of the game. Another question came in, Josh. I thought GDPR was only a European regulation. How does this affect my company in St. Louis? Well, if you remember what I was saying, and this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions of the GDPR regulation, is that it only applies to European boundaries. If you have servers in the United States and you're in St. Louis, if your server in St. Louis in the United States processes data from a European subject, you are subject to the GDPR regulations. If your data is processed and housed in the European Union and it keeps information about European data subjects, you are subject to GDPR. So although GDPR is for the 28 EU member states, it could apply to you if you're processing information that crosses geographical boundaries. And the last question here, and I really want to get to this question, and this is the last one. It says, our system doesn't allow data to be deleted. How do we comply with GDPR? Well, I think what the questioner is asking there is, in some validated systems, and I know a lot of the ones that I deal with, when you're entering information in validated systems, there's a non-delete policy that doesn't allow you to delete information about a subject matter. You may have experienced this as well, where in systems that are subject to 21 CFR Part 11, you're not allowed to delete the audit trail, because the audit trail has to be independent, and you're also not allowed to delete certain information, like user information, for example. You're allowed to decommission a user or turn off a user account, but the user stays in the system. So when you look at that, you need to rethink data policies, and this is one that will have impact on currently the way you're managing systems. You do have to comply with the right to be forgotten clause. Therefore, in your validated systems, you have to be able to deal with the fact that you have data that has to be deleted. So any data that is subject to EU GDPR guidelines, you're going to have to really address that information in mapping and allow that information to be deleted, but not only deleted, provide an audit trail and a reporting mechanism to make sure that once the data is deleted, it's reported to the authorities and to the specific individual. That's a great question, because when I thought about this, that was one of the things that crossed my mind, because most of the validated systems we do have a restriction on the deletion of certain information. So Josh, that was all that I had from the questions that came in earlier. Thanks so much.
I have one more. This is an easy one I can answer. So sorry I was a little late to attend. Is there any way I can get the slides afterwards? We will be sharing the recording afterwards, and then Valerie, I don't know if you'd be open to sharing the slides if someone wants them, but we could certainly.
Absolutely.
All right, we can.
Absolutely. Yes, this presentation was prepared for you, so if you'd like a copy of the slides, my email address is on the screen, vkbailey@onshoretech.com. Just shoot me an email and I'll send you a copy of the slides.
And I should be getting the recording out to everyone later this afternoon. So that's all that I have on my side. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Valerie, great session. Thanks for joining us today. I hope everyone has a great afternoon and evening. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.